The Boy in the Box, The Discovery. On a raw late February afternoon in 1957, the edges of Philadelphia felt softer and meaner at once. Softer because the brittle winter sun cut the winter chill into clean shadows. Meaner because the city seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something small and terrible to surface. Fox Chase, at the time, was a patchwork of woods, farms, and modest homes, a place where kids could still roam without adult eyes tracking every step. It was into that ordinary landscape that a discovery would be made that neither the neighborhood nor the nation would ever forget. A young man walked the brush along a less traveled lane. He later said he had been checking muskrat traps, an odd, somewhat illicit hobby on the outskirts of the city. He wasn't a man anyone would expect to find a body. He was a little embarrassed, out of place, and anxious about what anyone might think if they discovered his traps. So when he found a large, battered cardboard box tucked in the undergrowth and pried the flaps back without much thought, his first reaction was curiosity, not heroism. Inside the box was a child. The boy lay curled inside as if someone had tried to conserve space, like a suitcase closed over a secret. He was naked, small enough that the box swallowed him. The blanket that had been tossed over him was thin and worn, the type of fabric sold in ordinary stores across the eastern seaboard. But what was most immediate and arresting were the marks on the child's body, bruises, scars, and the tally of a life clearly lived without gentleness. His hair had been roughly cut, not a neat trim but the work of someone in a hurry or trying to change a child's appearance. His nails were clean and trimmed, an odd, almost tender detail that clashed with the rest of what they found. He was emaciated. Despite his years, his frame suggested prolonged neglect. For reasons that would echo through the story for decades, the man who found the box didn't call the police right away. He left. Fear of exposure for the traps for himself kept him silent. The box remained where it had been placed, the child left to the elements. It would be hours before a second passerby stumbled on the container. This man's reasons for being there were different. He had been loitering in the woods for other, more shameful purposes. Like the first man, his first instinct was not to run to the authorities. That silence, a pair of small human failures, bought time the boy did not have. The two men wrestled with conscience in separate spaces. One eventually confided in a pastor, the other left the scene with a guilt that would linger for life. Finally, an anonymous tip reached the police and officers made their way to the side of Susquehanna Road. The small, silent body inside the cardboard box became, overnight, an indictment of a city and a time. Detectives cataloged what they could. The box itself had been manufactured to ship a baby bassinet sold through a national retailer. The blanket bore a label and a weave pattern that tied it to a regional textile firm. These fragments felt promising because they were tangible, but they could just as easily be a false trail. A J.C. Penney box could have come from any number of households. A cheap flannel blanket could have been bought at any small mercantile within 100 miles. Still, the fact that such objects were ordinary, not unique, was part of what made the case so chilling. The boy had arrived in the world of people who used ordinary things and had nonetheless vanished without anyone's alarm. The medical examiner's early report read like the notes of a life stitched from small misfortunes. The child's age was estimated at roughly 4 to 6 years old. There were healed fractures, signs of repeated physical trauma and scars that suggested prior medical attention. He had small healed wounds that might have come from earlier abuse or accidents, and his physical development suggested chronic malnutrition. Yet there were no fillings in his teeth, no records to match, no school or doctor who could identify him. It was as though he had existed only to his abuser. Police did what they could with mid-century forensics. They photographed the child, dressed him in children's clothing, and circulated still images widely in hopes that someone would recognize what the photographs could not: a face, a name, a family. The reaction they wanted, a frantic mother, a neighbor's memory, did not arrive. Instead, the photographs became a national jolt. Newspapers splashed the story across their fronts, radio talk shows recited the details, and ordinary citizens found themselves confronting a human question they did not know how to answer. The initial weeks were a blur of leads, none of them clean. Teepsters called from across the country, insisting that the boy was theirs or that they had seen him walking down a particular street years ago. Each call demanded follow-up. Each follow-up chewed up manpower and time. Detectives traced the cardboard box to a set of stores. They logged the serial numbers of bassinets sold and attempted to cross-reference buyers. They checked local foster homes, hospitals, and orphanages. The blanket's weave pattern was charted, compared, and ultimately lost in a sea of similar products. What became increasingly difficult was the silence of the community. In a city where neighbors crowded streets and notices circulated, nobody stepped forward to name the boy. No family reported a missing member matching the description. No neighbor said, "We remember him." In the absence of a voice, the boy became the city's anonymous sorrow. He was buried in a potter's field, an unremarked grave meant for those without family claims. Police officers, medical staff, and strangers left flowers. A priest offered a short service, and a marker modest and stark was placed where the city could at least show its shame. The inscription read like a plea, a prayer to a God to whom at least some people still spoke in moments of helplessness. For the next several years, the grave would be a waypoint in the city's conscience. Children who grew up near the cemetery heard the story told in whispers. Teenagers dared one another to visit the marker. The boy's body, though gone, became a story the city could not close. The combination of brutal fact and confounding silence produced narratives among police and press. Was this a case of abandonment, a child stolen from some broken home, or a murder covered up by family shame? Each theory had its own ugliness. Detectives were left to decide not only who might have hurt the child, but why nobody had sounded the alarm. The answers required people to admit failure, to confess that a child could have been hidden under a roof while neighbors pretended ignorance. That discovery day, those two men who had seen the box and hesitated never forgot their reluctance. Later, under the heat of publicity, their choices would be dragged into the open as examples of how small acts of cowardice and embarrassment can alter the course of justice. Still, investigators could not build a motivated, prosecuted case out of guilt and what-ifs. They could only catalog the child's wounds and hope time, or conscience, would produce someone willing to speak. And that is where the discovery ended and the long, public obsession began. Photographs, coroner's diagrams, and police reports would not be enough to answer the most stubborn question: who had given this child life and who had taken it away? The boy in the box, theories and suspicions. The photograph of the child's face, eyes closed, small jaw slack, brow furrowed even in death, spread quickly through newspapers, radio scripts, and dinner table conversations. The nation reacted not just because a life had been taken. It reacted because the death was a jarring contradiction of post-war American assumptions, that the suburbs and small communities were safe, that families cared for their own, and that a child would not be allowed to languish in anonymous cruelty. Philadelphia Police Department's detectives found themselves at the center of a pressure cooker. The public demanded answers, politicians demanded results, and the evidence, stubbornly, offered very few. Not long after the discovery, police focused on physical clues. The bassinet box, a plain cardboard shipping container, had come from a large national department store. Store records suggested a limited run for the area. Detectives pulled invoices and sales slips, shadowing each sale back to a family address in hopes the child could be traced. The blanket, traced to a local textile manufacturer, was similarly promising because it seemed to provide a purchase trail. The problem was the nature of the objects themselves. They were common, mass-produced, and disposable. Any meaningful lead dissolved as investigators found the items in multiple homes. Investigators then turned to places children might hide: foster homes, orphanages, and institutions that cared for the city's most vulnerable. One foster home, not far from the location where the box had been abandoned, became the focus of whispers. Locals remembered the house as sternly run. There were hints of reprimand and strict rules rather than tender attentions. Detectives found that some of the blankets used there resembled the one with the boy. Some of the families had purchased bassinets of the type shipped in the box. The incremental pattern, object similarity, geographic proximity, and local rumor formed a logic that, for many, made the foster home the most likely origin. Yet suspicion is not proof. When officers interviewed the foster parents, they gave plausible, if not entirely satisfying, answers. They had bought bassinets, they owned blankets, they had children pass through their house, but no one could show that any child from their care had vanished or matched the child's specific scars, dental patterns, or ages. Without witness testimony, without records, without a name, the foster home suspicion remained a powerful but ultimately unprovable theory. Public fascination magnified every hint. One man working at the city medical examiner's office took on the case as a personal crusade. Remington Bristow, a name that would be tied to the case for decades, spent his own money on billboards. He printed and reprinted the boy's photographs, tracking tips and angling for answers that sometimes sat stubbornly out of reach. Bristow's efforts were the kind of civic obsession that can look either noble or obsessive depending on your tolerance for ends justifying means. He organized inquiries, pressed for museum-quality preservation of the evidence, and haunted courthouse halls for anyone who might listen. And then came the flood of false leads that any high-profile case attracts. Some callers swore the boy had been seen with travelers and carnies. Others remembered a child from a hospital ward. Some confessions were bizarre, a person calling to say they had seen a child's burial in a different town, and sometimes these confessions were designed to bait the authorities or to insert the caller's name into history. Each new tip chewed police time. Detectives ran down every thread because the possibility that any one tip might break the case was worth the effort. But many threads snapped at the first tug. In the vacuum between evidence and truth, theories proliferated. Some believed the boy had been a foster child who somehow died and was quietly, shamefully buried by those who feared scandal. Others suspected an out-of-town family might have given the boy away or hidden him after damage to the family's reputation. A darker cluster of theories suggested ritualized abuse or a network of adults who kept children isolated. None of those theories could be excluded, and none could be proved with the materials at hand. The press, of course, fed the fascination and the fear. Columnists spun narratives that complicated police work. Were there liars among the callers? Were some people inventing stories literally to be at the center of attention? Reporters pitted neighbor against neighbor, and the city's appetite for the story grew as large as its frustration. Editorial pages debated whether the police should try modern methods, polygraphs, go-between informants, or psychics. Psychics were a frequent, if disreputable, part of mid-century investigations. Desperate families and police often tolerated their involvement on the off chance that some stray detail might lead to a lead. One of the most dramatic episodes in the early years came from a woman known to investigators only as Martha, a pseudonym given by the press. She came forward with a narrative that sat between the credible and the confounding. Martha said she had been connected to children's services and that she had specific, painful memories of a child who matched the photograph. She described people she said were involved, a location where a child might have been hidden, and a chain of events that, at first blush, fit too cleanly not to merit follow-up. What made Martha's story so dangerous as a lead was not just its content but its specificity. She pointed to names, gave dates, or what she claimed were dates, and described behaviors that matched rumors floating through Fox Chase. Detectives brought her statements to witnesses. They compared medical information she supplied against the boy's known injuries. For months, Martha's disclosures sent police in a flurry of activity. But again, the issue of proof remained fatal. Martha's narrative, while detailed, lacked corroborating documentation. The people she identified denied knowledge or produced alibis. Institutions she named had no records to match her account. As often happens in such cases, memory, shame, and rumor can conspire to produce accounts that feel true but cannot be verified. Investigators were left to weigh the moral cost of pursuing an unprovable accusation against the moral imperative of finding justice for a dead child. As the 1960s arrived, public interest in the case cooled, but the case file did not. New detectives were assigned periodically. Older ones kept folders with pressed newspaper clippings and photocopied evidence. The boy's grave remained a small point of pilgrimage for those who felt the city had failed him. And in quieter moments, the investigators who never fully left the case would write notes to themselves about things to try if technology improved, if records emerged, if a conscience broke. They preserved the hope that time and science might provide what memory and rumor could not. By the end of the decade, a strange cultural afterlife had also attached itself to the boy in the box. He became, in a way, a mirror for the country, a small naked mirror reflecting anxieties about family, welfare, and anonymity in modern life. Writers, filmmakers, and amateur sleuths would point to the case for decades as an example of society's blind spots. And yet amid the analysis and the essays, the one question nobody could answer remained heartbreakingly simple: who had loved him? The answers were still out there, or so many people believed. Theories multiplied, witness statements accumulated dust, and the city continued to steady itself around the persistent ache. Then, just as investigators began to resign themselves to working an unsolvable case, a new generation of efforts, outsiders, obsessed citizens, and ultimately advances in forensic science many years away, would breathe renewed life into questions that had never stopped demanding answers. The boy in the box, the woman named Martha. By the early 1960s, the case of the boy in the box had cooled into a haunting puzzle, a file that detectives revisited but rarely advanced. It was a story stamped into Philadelphia's collective memory, yet each year it slipped a little further from the headlines. That is, until a strange woman stepped forward with a confession so detailed, so disturbing, that it reignited the entire investigation. Her name was Martha. The press used only her first name, but in reality, she was a troubled woman from the suburbs with a long history of mental health struggles. In 1960, she approached investigators with a tale that seemed almost too bizarre to believe. But unlike the dozens of cranks, attention seekers, and false confessors who had come before, Martha knew things that sounded chillingly plausible. Martha's story. Martha claimed that her abusive mother had purchased or somehow acquired the little boy. According to her, the child had been kept in the basement of their home, treated more like a prisoner than a son. She alleged that the boy was subjected to repeated physical abuse, neglected, and rarely allowed outside. One winter evening, Martha said, her mother grew enraged at the child for vomiting in the house. In a fit of fury, she beat him to death. Martha claimed she watched in horror as her mother then cleaned the boy, cut his hair, and wrapped him in a blanket before stuffing him into a cardboard box. The next day, Martha alleged, her mother drove to the outskirts of Philadelphia, pulled over near Susquehanna Road, and dumped the box in the woods where it would later be found. To detectives starved for leads, her account was electrifying. For the first time in years, someone was giving a step-by-step narrative of how the boy could have ended up in the box, and in her version, the details seemed to line up with what investigators already knew. The haircut, the blanket, the placement in the box, the location in Fox Chase. Could this finally be the answer? Investigating Martha. Detectives immediately launched into Martha's background. They interviewed relatives, friends, and neighbors. They scoured the house she had described. They looked for evidence of a boy who had once been hidden there, a toy, a photograph, a scar on the wall. But nothing matched. Neighbors insisted they had never seen such a boy. Martha's mother denied everything, saying her daughter was troubled and prone to elaborate fantasies. Medical records confirmed that Martha had spent years in psychiatric institutions. Even so, investigators weren't ready to dismiss her. Some of her details were eerily specific. For example, she described the boy being bathed and his hair cut after death, facts not widely publicized in the newspapers. How could she have known that unless she was connected? Skeptics argued that these details might have leaked out through rumors or stray comments in the press. In a city obsessed with the case, small facts had a way of spreading like gossip. Detectives followed every thread Martha gave them. She identified places where the boy might have stayed, people who might have seen him, moments in which he was alive. They checked them all. Each one collapsed under scrutiny. No records, no corroborating witnesses, no physical evidence. In the end, Martha's story, compelling as it was, went nowhere. Officially, the police declared her unreliable, but unofficially, some detectives admitted that her account gnawed at them for years. The foster home again. Martha's confession was not the only path investigators were pursuing. Around the same time, whispers about the foster home near the dump site re-emerged. Remington Bristow, the medical examiner's office employee who had made the case his personal crusade, remained convinced the foster home was the key. He spent countless hours surveilling the property, digging into the foster father's background, and interviewing anyone connected to the household. Bristow even consulted a psychic, who reportedly led him straight to the foster home's property during a session. To Bristow, this was confirmation that he was on the right track. To others, it was a sign that obsession was clouding his judgment. The problem was the same as always: suspicion without proof. Yes, the foster home used blankets like the one found with the boy. Yes, they had bassinets like the one that came in the box. But in the 1950s and 1960s, so did many families across Philadelphia. Nothing directly tied the boy to the home. Still, Bristow's theory had a powerful hold on the public imagination. For decades, many amateur sleuths and even some detectives considered the foster home theory the most plausible explanation. The case goes cold. By the late 1960s, the investigation had largely stalled. Detectives had followed thousands of tips, interviewed hundreds of people, and crossed state lines chasing down leads, but nothing stuck. The boy in the box remained nameless, voiceless, and unidentified. As new crimes flooded police dockets, organized crime, drug-related homicides, racial unrest, political assassinations, the little boy in the cardboard box faded from the headlines. His case was still open, still technically active, but it became one of those unsolved mysteries that lived more in memory than in motion. Yet the mystery never fully disappeared. Detectives kept the file alive, revisiting it when technology advanced. Journalists returned to the story every few years, writing anniversary features and reminding the public of Philadelphia's most enduring cold case. And amateur investigators, people like Bristow, refused to let it go. The boy's grave became a site of pilgrimage. Ordinary Philadelphians left flowers, toys, and prayers. The headstone reading, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy," became one of the most visited in the city. The case had shifted from an active hunt to something else: a ghost story, a civic wound, a puzzle without a solution. And then in the 1980s, as forensics began to advance, police tried something new. They exhumed the boy's body. The first exhumation. In 1988, more than 3 decades after his discovery, the boy in the box was exhumed from his Potter's Field grave. For the first time, forensic specialists used new techniques to extract DNA from his remains. It wasn't much. Technology was still primitive compared to what it would later become, but it was something. The DNA was preserved for future testing. The boy was reburied in a new plot at Ivy Hill Cemetery, this time with a larger headstone reading, "America's Unknown Child." The grave was paid for by donations from the public and from detectives who had worked the case. At the reburial, dozens of police officers and community members gathered. Some of the original investigators were there, now older, gray, retired. They admitted they had carried the case with them every day of their careers. Seeing the boy laid to rest again felt both like closure and like reopening a wound. But the DNA, they hoped, would one day be the key. A haunting silence. Even with DNA in hand, the case remained cold for years. In the 1990s, detectives re-examined Martha's story, the foster home suspicions, and other lingering theories. Nothing new emerged. And yet, the boy in the box refused to fade from memory. Every generation rediscovered the story, retelling it in newspapers, books, and eventually on television shows about unsolved mysteries. Each retelling carried the same image: a small boy in a box, waiting for someone to speak his name. But it would take decades and a revolution in forensic science before that name would finally be spoken. The boy in the box science awakens the case. By the time the 1990s arrived, the boy in the box had been part of Philadelphia's shadow history for nearly 4 decades. He was no longer just a mystery of the past. He had become a symbol of the city's collective unease, a case that represented both the limits of mid-century police work and the stubborn endurance of unanswered questions. But the 1990s were also a decade of rapid technological advancement in law enforcement. DNA analysis was becoming a powerful new tool, reshaping how cold cases could be approached. For detectives who had spent years staring at the boy in the box file, there was a glimmer of hope. Maybe science could succeed where human investigation had failed. The 1998 forensic push. In 1998, investigators decided to re-examine the DNA extracted during the boy's 1988 exhumation. By then, techniques had improved, and partial profiles could sometimes be enough to build genealogical leads. Scientists hoped they might identify a maternal line, or at least establish a stronger genetic record for future testing. While the testing didn't yield an immediate family match, it did create a viable DNA profile for law enforcement to hold onto. That profile would become the key decades later, but at the time, it felt like progress without payoff. Detectives admitted privately that the boy in the box remained what one investigator called a black hole. Leads went in but never came out, but the DNA at least gave them a thread to carry forward. The face of the unknown child. If DNA couldn't yet tell the boy's story, maybe his face could. In 1998, forensic experts created a new facial reconstruction using computer modeling. For the first time in years, the public was given an updated image of what the boy might have looked like when he was alive. The reconstruction was haunting: a small child with a round face, short hair, and wide eyes that seemed both innocent and weary. When local newspapers printed the image, Philadelphians who had been alive in 1957 shuddered. Some swore they recognized him. Tips trickled in again from people who thought the boy resembled a neighbor's child or someone they once knew. But as with so many tips, nothing panned out. The boy's likeness stirred emotions but brought no answers. Still, the reconstructions became a staple of the case. Over the next 2 decades, updated versions would be created, each time with more accuracy as technology improved. Each time, people hoped the face might jog a memory that had been dormant for decades. The rise of internet sleuths. The 2000s brought another transformation: the internet. Suddenly, cold cases could be discussed not just in local newspapers or late-night radio shows, but on forums, blogs, and eventually social media. The boy in the box found a second life online. Amateur sleuths, true crime enthusiasts, and genealogists began dissecting the case on platforms like WebSleuths. They exchanged theories, analyzed old newspaper scans, and shared every scrap of information they could find. For many of these online detectives, The case represented the perfect riddle, a small set of fixed facts, a haunting image, and a mystery that had eluded professionals for half a century. Some of the most popular online theories revolved around the foster home theory, still persistent, fueled by the coincidences of the blanket and the bassinet. The Martha confession, debated endlessly, was she telling the truth or just seeking attention? Human trafficking or illegal adoption, a darker theory suggesting the boy had been bought or traded, explaining why no one reported him missing. Runaway medical family theory. Some speculated that the boy's parents may have been wealthy or educated, choosing silence to protect their reputations after his death. The internet didn't solve the case, but it kept it alive. It introduced the boy in the box to a new generation who hadn't grown up with the story in their local paper. And importantly, it meant that when new forensic developments came, the public was already watching. The national spotlight. By the early 2000s, the case had been featured on national programs like America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries, each retelling reignited waves of interest. In fact, some detectives argued that the boy's case was kept alive more by public fascination than by official police work. One retired Philadelphia detective admitted, "We never really closed the file, but honestly, it was the public, the people who never forgot him, who kept this case from disappearing. Every time it showed up on TV, we got new calls. None solved it, but it kept him from fading away." And that persistence mattered. The boy in the box was no longer just an old file gathering dust. He was part of America's true crime culture, a name invoked whenever cold cases were discussed. 2001, the case reopened. In 2001, the Philadelphia Police Department officially reopened the investigation. This wasn't just symbolic. It meant fresh eyes, fresh resources, and a willingness to re-examine old evidence with new techniques. One of the biggest steps came when investigators collaborated with the Vidocq Society, a prestigious group of forensic experts and former detectives who specialize in cold cases. The Vidocq Society, based in Philadelphia, had a reputation for tackling the most perplexing mysteries, and the boy in the box fit perfectly into their mission. Members of the society pored over the original files, reanalyzed the crime scene photos, and revisited the old suspects. Their conclusion was sobering. The case could be solved, but only with DNA. The paper trail of witnesses and suspects had gone cold. Only science could cut through the silence. A new exhumation. In 2019, more than 60 years after his body was first found, investigators made a bold decision. The boy in the box would be exhumed again. This time, forensic technology had advanced so dramatically that even degraded remains could potentially yield a full DNA profile suitable for genealogical tracing. The process was meticulous. Specialists carefully recovered bone and tooth samples, which were then sent to advanced labs for extraction. Unlike the 1988 attempt, this exhumation was done with one specific goal in mind: to identify the boy through genealogical DNA matching. By now, the world had changed. Genealogical DNA had been used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, cracking open a case that had baffled California for decades. If it could work there, why not in Philadelphia? The waiting game. As the 2010s turned into the 2020s, investigators waited for the science to catch up with their hopes. Labs worked on extracting usable DNA. Genealogists began building family trees. Forensic experts compared markers, hunting for matches in public databases. It was slow, grueling work. For detectives, the waiting was almost unbearable. Some had dedicated their entire careers to the boy's case. Others had inherited it as part of their cold case assignments, only to find themselves emotionally attached after months of staring at the boy's photograph. One detective recalled, "Every time I looked at his picture, I thought of my own son. This wasn't just a file. This was a child who deserved to have his name back. The case transforms. By now, the boy in the box had shifted from being a local mystery to an international symbol of persistence. Documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube channels revisited the story. The boy's face circulated widely online, his haunting image shared millions of times. For decades, he had been America's unknown child. But as forensic genealogy gained traction, hope swelled that this label might finally disappear. The public didn't know it yet, but the case was on the brink of a breakthrough that would shake Philadelphia and the true crime world. In 2022, The Boy in the Box, a name after 65 years. For 65 years, he was America's unknown child, a nameless boy buried first in a potter's field and later at Ivy Hill Cemetery, remembered only by a haunting photograph and the inscription on his headstone. Detectives carried his image in their wallets. Families left flowers and toys at his grave. Generations of Philadelphians grew up knowing the story of the boy in the box. But on December 8, 2022, everything changed. In a press conference that drew national attention, the Philadelphia Police Department stood before reporters and confirmed what many had thought impossible. The boy in the box had a name. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The breakthrough. The path to Joseph's identification had been decades in the making. It was only possible because of advancements in forensic genealogy, the same technology that had identified the Golden State Killer. After the boy's 2019 exhumation, specialists were able to extract high-quality DNA samples from his remains. That DNA was uploaded into genealogical databases, where trained researchers began constructing potential family trees. Slowly, piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Matches were found with distant relatives. Branches of family trees narrowed down the possibilities. Eventually, genealogists identified a couple in Philadelphia who had been Joseph's parents. When detectives confirmed the link with birth records, the mystery child in the box finally had an identity. Born January 13, 1953, Joseph Augustus Zarelli was just 4 years old when he died. His short life had been spent in West Philadelphia. His family, still living in the area, had never reported him missing. It was a stunning revelation. For decades, people had speculated that the boy was a runaway from another state, a kidnapped child, or an abandoned orphan. Instead, he had lived and died just miles from where his body was found. The press conference. When Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw announced Joseph's name to the public, she described it as both a triumph and a tragedy. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, we have finally given this precious boy his name back. The commissioner's voice cracked slightly as she spoke, acknowledging the years of dedication from detectives who never gave up. Behind her, a photograph of Joseph appeared on the screen, not the morgue photo from 1957, but a digitally restored picture of what he might have looked like in life. Reporters scribbled furiously. For the first time, the boy wasn't just an unidentified victim. He was a child with a birthday, a family, and a story. The family mystery. But with Joseph's identity came disturbing questions. Police confirmed that Joseph's biological parents were identified. His mother, who had lived in Philadelphia, had since died. His father, too, had passed away. Both had other children, meaning Joseph had living siblings, possibly half-siblings, who had grown up never knowing about the brother they lost. Even more shocking, no one in the family had ever reported Joseph missing. Why? This question immediately became the focus of speculation. Some believed Joseph had been a victim of child abuse, hidden by his parents to avoid discovery. Others suggested that relatives may have known the truth but stayed silent out of fear, shame, or denial. Police refused to release the names of the siblings, citing privacy. But they did confirm that Joseph's family was aware of his identification. Some relatives, they said, had cooperated in the investigation. The revelation ignited a painful reality. Joseph's killer was likely someone very close to him, but with both parents deceased, would the truth ever be uncovered? A city reacts. Philadelphia responded with an outpouring of emotion. For decades, residents had carried the boy in the box in their hearts as an adopted child of the city. To finally learn his name was overwhelming. At Ivy Hill Cemetery, mourners left flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes. Someone left a small toy truck with a card that read, "Rest easy, Joseph. We finally know who you are." Local newspapers published Joseph's name on their front pages. Television anchors, some of whom had grown up hearing the story, grew emotional while reporting the news. True crime communities online lit up with discussion. The name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli, trended across social media platforms as people around the world shared the story. After 65 years, the boy was no longer an unknown. The unanswered questions. But the breakthrough brought as many questions as it did answers. Who killed Joseph? Police declined to speculate publicly, but said the investigation into his death was still considered active. Why didn't anyone report him missing? A 4-year-old vanishes and the family says nothing. The silence was almost as chilling as the crime itself. What did his siblings know? If Joseph had living brothers and sisters, were they aware of his existence? Had they grown up with whispers in the family, or was he erased from their history? Could anyone still be alive who was responsible? Joseph's parents were gone, but what about extended family, caretakers, or others in his circle? Detectives admitted that while the name was a breakthrough, it didn't close the case. In some ways, it reopened it entirely. A detective's perspective. For detectives who had inherited the case over the years, Joseph's identification was the culmination of decades of hope. One retired detective put it simply, "We always said we didn't just want to know who killed him. We wanted to know who he was. That was step one. Step two is finding out why and how he ended up in that box." The emotional toll was evident. Some investigators had died before seeing the day Joseph was named. Others wept openly at the press conference. To them, Joseph was no longer a faceless victim. He was a child who had been hidden, silenced, and forgotten, until science gave him back his identity. A legacy of persistence. Joseph's story became a symbol of what persistence in law enforcement can achieve. The case had spanned generations of detectives, journalists, and ordinary citizens who refused to forget. The police credited the public for keeping the case alive. Without the community's obsession, Joseph might have been lost to history. Instead, he was remembered long enough for science to catch up. And yet the mystery remained unresolved. Joseph had a name but not justice. The final chapter was still unwritten. The press release, word for word. At the press conference, Commissioner Outlaw ended with these words, "Though this child's entire identity and rightful heritage has been taken away, we affirm today that he matters, that he was loved by many, and that we will not stop seeking justice for Joseph Augustus Zarelli." Her words resonated far beyond Philadelphia. Across the world, Joseph's name was spoken aloud. A child who had been anonymous for 65 years, now recognized as part of history. The boy in the box was gone. In his place stood a boy named Joseph, whose short life and tragic death had finally been acknowledged. But one question still haunted everyone. Who killed him? The boy in the box, justice still waiting. When Philadelphia Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw announced Joseph Augustus Zarelli's name in December 2022, the city finally knew who the boy in the box was. For the first time in 65 years, the child in the cardboard box had an identity. But almost immediately after the applause and the tears, another question filled the silence. Would anyone ever be held accountable for his death? The investigation reopens. The identification of Joseph gave detectives a powerful new lead. With his name, they could build out his family tree, interview surviving relatives, and reconstruct the environment in which he lived. But the passage of time was a cruel obstacle. Joseph had died in 1957. His parents, the most obvious suspects or witnesses, were both long deceased. His mother had died in 1991 and his father in 2014. That left siblings and extended family. Some were alive, some were cooperating with the investigation, and others remained silent. Police were careful not to accuse anyone publicly, but they made it clear. The case was still considered active, and Joseph's killer could still be identified. Detectives combed through old family records, school registers, and neighborhood accounts. They searched for any signs of reported abuse, medical records, or sudden disappearances that might link back to Joseph's short life. But the deeper they dug, the murkier the family history became. The silence of the family. Perhaps the most chilling detail of all was that Joseph was never reported missing. A 4-year-old boy vanished, and no one in his immediate family said a word. Why? That silence has haunted investigators and the public alike. It suggests a cover-up, perhaps even complicity. If his parents killed him, why didn't his siblings speak up later in life? If his death was an accident, why not explain? If someone else was responsible, why did his family erase him from their history? Some detectives believe the silence itself is the biggest clue. It implies that those closest to Joseph knew exactly what had happened and chose secrecy over truth. But proving that, after more than 6 decades, is almost impossible. Theories that still linger. Even with Joseph's identity revealed, theories continue to swirl. Some are grounded in evidence, others in speculation. Parental abuse, the most straightforward theory. Joseph was beaten to death or fatally injured by one of his parents. The silence afterward fits with a family trying to conceal abuse. Extended family involvement. Some believe Joseph may have been staying with relatives when he died, explaining why his parents never reported him missing. Medical neglect or accident. Another theory is that Joseph died from untreated illness or neglect. In the 1950s, child welfare systems were weaker, and parents could sometimes conceal such tragedies. The Martha connection, though officially discredited, Martha's story about her abusive mother taking in a boy has eerie parallels with Joseph's case. Could she have crossed paths with Joseph, or was her confession a coincidence? Foster home theory. Though largely dismissed after Joseph's identification, some sleuths still believe the foster home near Susquehanna Road played a role, perhaps as a caretaker or intermediary. None of these theories have been proven, and after so many years, much of the physical evidence is gone, memories are faded, and key witnesses are dead. The detectives who never gave up. One of the most remarkable aspects of the boy in the box case is how many detectives carried it as a personal mission. Some kept his photo in their wallets long after retirement. Others visited his grave annually. For them, Joseph was not just another unsolved file. He was a child who had been abandoned twice, once in death, and once in the silence of his family. Detectives describe the case as a ghost that never let go. When modern forensic genealogy finally revealed Joseph's name, many of those detectives were no longer alive. But their persistence, their refusal to close the book, is what kept the case alive long enough for science to deliver answers. The public's role. The boy in the box was never just a police case. It became part of Philadelphia's identity, a mystery that citizens carried as their own. Ordinary people left flowers at his grave. Journalists wrote anniversary pieces. Schoolchildren learned the story as a cautionary tale. True crime writers and internet sleuths dissected every theory. Without this public obsession, Joseph might have been forgotten. Instead, his memory became a thread tying generations together. The legacy of Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Now that he has a name, Joseph's story carries even greater weight. He is no longer just a mystery. He is a real boy who lived, who had siblings, who was part of a family and a community. His grave at Ivy Hill Cemetery has become a site of renewed pilgrimage. Visitors bring flowers, teddy bears, and prayers. Some leave handwritten notes addressed to Joseph, telling him he is no longer forgotten. The headstone, which once read "America's Unknown Child," now stands as both a reminder of his decades of anonymity and a promise that he has finally been claimed by history. Justice or closure? For investigators, the case is not over. They continue to pursue leads, hoping to answer the final question of who killed Joseph and why. But privately, many admit that justice in the traditional sense may never come. Too much time has passed. Too many people are gone. Still, the identification itself is a form of justice. After 65 years, Joseph was given back what was stolen from him: his name, his identity, his story. A symbol of hope. Joseph's case has also become a beacon of hope for other cold cases. It proves that persistence matters, that science can catch up with mystery, and that no victim should ever be forgotten. Across the country, families with missing children looked at Joseph's story and wondered if their loved ones might one day be identified too. Detectives with old files on their desks pointed to Joseph as proof that it's never too late. The final mystery. The boy in the box is no longer an unknown child. He is Joseph Augustus Zarelli. But the final mystery, who ended his life and why, remains. Perhaps one day, a surviving relative will speak. Perhaps new evidence will emerge from an overlooked file. Perhaps DNA will provide not just a name, but a link to his killer. Until then, Joseph's story stands as one of America's most haunting reminders of both tragedy and resilience. He was a child who died voiceless, but who was remembered long enough for the world to finally say his name. And that name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli, will be spoken for generations to come.